today is Father's Day. Congratulate all of you who are fathers. How many people in here had a father? At some point or other. Some of you aren't raising your hands. I was going to ask how many of you knew your father or whatever, but the odds are some of you didn't. And I didn't want to bring any embarrassment there. The odds are that some of you didn't know your dad. In fact, today, on average, 40% of American kids across the racial spectrum are born without a father in the family. 40%. In the African American community, 72% of children are born without a father in the home. If that's the case, and it comes from all different kinds of surveys and studies, if let's use the 40%, almost half of our children are born into families without a dad. How do those kids learn how to be dads, the boys? How do the girls learn what a dad or a father or a husband is supposed to be like? How do they learn how to be treated? They grow up without an example of what a father at all, let alone a good father, is supposed to look like. And so it's no wonder that those numbers are getting worse instead of better. Our children have no example. In fact, even if we were to tell them, go to the Bible and look at the examples of fathers in the Bible, the majority of biblical examples of fatherhood are not good either. The majority of the time when we look and see how fathers and sons interacted, it's not a good thing. For example, Eli was the high priest. You remember Eli, he was high priest when Samuel was born, and he was the one that Samuel's mom was praying, and he thought that she was drunk, and she said, no, I'm just pouring my heart out to God. He was a horrible father. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, we read about them in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 through 26, if you'd like to look at that story later on. These were horrible guys. They were acting as priests. They were priests, but the way they were priests were not the way God wanted them to. Their example from their father was not being acted. He didn't do anything about it. When we look at what they were doing, we see that as people were bringing sacrifices to the altar, they were supposed to bring the sacrifice. They would kill the lamb, kill the goat, kill the bull, and put it on the altar, and it was supposed to be a burnt offering. There were parts of that after it had been offered to God, parts of it were supposed to be completely burned. Other parts were to be eaten by the family. Other parts were to be given to the priest as their portion, as an inheritance from God. Well, what Phinehas and Hophni were doing, when they were showing up, before they ever would even kill the lamb or the goat or the bull, they would say, these are the parts we want. I don't want a New York steak strip this week. I want the ribeye. And make sure you get plenty of fat in there. Well, the fat was supposed to be God's portion. And they were taking it. They were going in, and whenever it would be a boiled offering, they would stick their fork in, and if they didn't like it, they'd dump it back and keep going until they got the parts that they wanted. And so people would say, no, these are supposed to be to God. And they were like, no, we're the high priest. If you're going to make an offering, you're going to do it our way, not God's way. Another thing that they were doing, the Bible tells us that they were, in our English, it says that they were sleeping with the women who ministered at the gate of the temple. But if we go back and look at the Hebrew and consider what it was, what they were implying there, the fact is that they were bringing temple prostitution into God's house. They were doing what all the nations around them were doing, and they were bringing women in to have them be temple prostitutes in God's house. God said at one point that He didn't think about that. He said, I didn't ask for it. I didn't even think about asking for it. And the only other thing that He said about that was killing children in His name. When they would sacrifice children, He said, I didn't ask for that. Those two things are the two things God said, I never even thought about it. And so these men were not doing and not acting like they should have. They were not acting like they were priests. And Eli did nothing about it. In fact, at one point it says he went and told them, oh, you guys shouldn't be acting like that. That was it. Okay. Great fatherhood there. We find out that later on they died, and he had been warned, and he died and broke his neck as well as he learned that his sons had died. Samuel, one of the good guys of the Bible. We don't read hardly anything bad about Samuel in his entire life. One of the few men that the Bible is like that about. But he had two sons. Their names was Joel and Abijah. And they were judges just like their father. So they grew up to be just like their dad, with a little bit of an exception. See, Samuel was an honest guy. Samuel was the kind of guy we want our judges to be in America. They're the kind of guy we want our sons to grow up to be like. Samuel was a good guy. His sons, on the other hand, Joel and Abijah, were corrupt. They were corrupt judges. They accepted bribes. Sounds like people in El Paso, maybe. They would have fit in nicely here. They twisted justice. Whoever was the most popular person would get the justice. Whoever would bribe them the most would get the justice. They'd take money from both sides and then not give either one of them a good outcome. You see, God had intended the judges to be men of good reputation, of good repute, men that everyone would look up to. And these two men were so bad that the Bible says they were so bad that Israel asked for a king. They didn't want God anymore because God's representative, the judges, were corrupt. God's representatives were evil. God's representatives were not representing God very well. And so the people said, we don't want God to be our king anymore. We want a king like these other countries. And they caused men to turn away from God. And the Bible says that Samuel did nothing about it. King David, another good guy from the Bible. We read a few bad things about him, but for the most part, David was a good guy. But he wasn't a good dad. He wasn't a good father. In fact, one time, one of his sons raped one of his daughters, and David did nothing. Another one of his sons, Absalom, was so upset, he looked to his dad to bring justice to the family. Nothing happened, and so he took it into his own hands, killed his brother, and because he thought his dad was going to kill him for doing it, he ran away, and the family was split forever. There was never any reconciliation. David was not a great dad. And because he wasn't a great dad, his son never learned how to be a good dad. And Solomon, the wisest man, the Bible says, that ever lived or ever will live, was a horrible father. His son Rehoboam gives us an example of what he learned from his dad. That right after Solomon had died, Solomon had this ongoing fight with a guy named Jeroboam for years. And Jeroboam comes to Rehoboam and he says, well, I've been fighting with your dad. I've had this civil war going on. But if you will lower the taxes back to where they should be, we will serve you forever. You see, Solomon, contrary to what God's word had told him to do, had raised taxes incredible amount. In fact, the Bible uses, I don't know if it's exact, but it uses the word 666 talents. 666, the devil, evil. It talked to the Hebrew people and said this was not a thing that should have been happening. And so Jeroboam comes to Rehoboam and says, if you will lower those taxes back to where they should be, we will serve you forever. Rehoboam says, give me some time, I'll think about it. He goes to his father's advisors, Solomon's advisors. He says, what should I do? And these older men, these men of wisdom said, lower the taxes. We've paid for the temple, we've paid for the palace, we paid for all of your dad's wives and horses and all of that. We're not at war, we don't need these taxes. Lower the taxes. Rehoboam goes to his friends, young men, not very wise, and they say, make them know who's king. Raise the taxes even more. And so Rehoboam goes back to Jeroboam and says, you thought my dad was bad. Wait till you see me. Get a load of me. And so Jeroboam and 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel take off. And Israel is split, never to be put back together again until God does it at the end of time. We don't have very many positive examples of fatherhood in the Bible. But we do have some good teaching. Listen to these words from the Apostle Paul. It comes from the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 4. It says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. That word exasperate is a big word. It just means to anger, to provoke, to cause them to be upset at what you're doing. He says, don't do that. Don't provoke them. Don't cause them to be angry, but instead, raise them up to know the Lord. Raise them up to understand what the Lord has called us to be as men and as women. Colossians, same writer, the Apostle Paul, in the book of Colossians, writes this in chapter 3, verse 21. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. What does that word embitter mean? It means to stir up, to provoke, to embitter them, to provoke them, to irritate them, to cause them to be angry. Again, Paul is saying the same thing. Don't do that to your kids. Well, how do we know how to do that? How do we know how not to embitter our kids? how not to provoke them, how not to exasperate them. We don't have a lot of good examples in the Bible. The majority of our culture doesn't have fathers to learn from. And so what do? Well, first of all, we need to know what is it that children want from us as parents. The good stuff, not just the bad stuff. We all know they want candy and they want to be spoiled and they want to get their way. We all know that part. That goes without saying. But what do they want on a deep level? What do they need? Let's put it that way from us as fathers. There's a difference. Sons and daughters want different things. And there's a difference between boys and girls. Sons. How many of you have had a son that you are adults? How many of you men were sons? All of you, right? So let's think back. If you had a son or if you were a son, think back. What happened when you got your first bicycle? Think back. You learned to ride. You rode pretty well. Did you take nice and leisurely slow rides around the block? Or did you speed around the block, jumping curbs? How many of you were like the boy I heard about that went around the block once and said, "Look, Mom, no hands." Came around the next time and said, "Look, Mom, no teeth." That's boys for you. You know, how many of you taught your son how to make noises? No, we don't teach them that. We don't teach them how to make motor noises. Boys just grow up knowing that engines go boom, you know, and all of that. They also, the whole bodily noise thing, and we're not going to go into very far. We don't teach them those things. They just know them. That's boys for you. Elizabeth says that all the time. Noah, you're just being such a boy. In fact, I heard her say it this morning. I don't know what it was about. Something to do with breakfast. Boys are just different. What kind of games do boys play? They play construction sometimes. They play army, cowboys and Indians. In fact, one of my best friends that I knew basically up until I moved here, and I've lost track of him since then, and we've all moved different places, and he and his brother used to play cowboys and Indians with a .22 and a real bow and arrow. It's a good thing they weren't very good shots. But they used to shoot at each other, for real, with a .22 and a bow and arrow. Boys are just different. Girls, on the other hand, what do they play? Without us having to teach them, without us, my daughters are always asking me, "Dad, come play Barbie." How do you play Barbie? I don't know these things. And so I sit there for a while, I'm bored to tears because I just don't get the game, and yet it's what my daughters need. It's what my daughters want. They play weddings. They play tea parties. Last night I did a wedding over on the east side, and there was a little 2.5-year-old girl that the music was playing and they were just waiting for the bride to show up, and she was out there with her grandma just dancing, and nobody had to teach her how to dance. You know, nobody had to tell her this is what little girls do. They just do that. It's what they know. And so boys and girls are different. And what they need from us as fathers is different. If we were to treat our daughters like we treat our sons, or treat our sons like we treat our daughters, they're not going to get everything from us as dads that they need. See, boys have one question that they want to ask of a parent. Do I have what it takes? Am I capable of being a man? Am I good enough? Can I do it? Do I have what it takes? Daughters, on the other hand, say, "Dad, am I lovely? Am I worth it? Am I worth pursuing?" We get the same idea in Matthew chapter 3, verse 17. God is talking. Jesus has just been baptized. John is just baptized, and he comes out of the water, and we get this picture of the skies opening up, and it says the Spirit of the Lord descended on him in the form of a dove, and they heard a voice. And the voice said, "This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy." In chapter 17, verse 5, towards the end of the ministry of Jesus, 3 years later, we hear those exact words. They're on the mountain there. Jesus has just been transfigured in front of Peter, James, and John, and Moses and Elijah are there. Peter has just finished again, opening his mouth when he probably should have just listened. And he said, "Can we build him a house?" And God says, "No, this is my dearly loved Son," exact same words, "who brings me great joy." But then he adds this, "Listen to him." You see, God is telling Jesus in both places, "I love him." But he's showing him here, he can do it. He's got what it takes. He can be successful. Listen to him. If you get from him what you need, through him, you will get what you need. And so our sons and our daughters are different. And we need to make sure that we answer those questions for them. We need to answer that for them. Yes, son, you have what it takes. You know, when I was reading a book this week, it's called What Every Father Needs to Know. And in it, the guy talks about his sons. They were out rock climbing with their dad. And the son's climbing up there, and his dad, he gets to the top, he looks down, his dad says, "Man, you were awesome. You're a wild man." And they just go on. He doesn't think a thing about it. But that night, just as he's tucking his son into bed, his son says, "Dad, do you really believe that I'm a wild man?" That meant something to him. That meant you can do it. You're successful. You're there. I believe in you. And that's what boys need to hear from us. Girls need to know that they're worth pursuing, that they're lovely, that they're beautiful. It's the same thing for us as adults. I tell people at weddings all the time that survey after survey says that men need to hear something different from their wives than wives need to hear from their husbands. Men need to get respect from their wives. Not respect as in, oh, I bow down to you, but respect so they know that their wife believes in them. It's the same thing. They know that their wife says, "Honey, you can do it. You can succeed. I believe in you." And wives need to know that they are worth pursuing. I told Elizabeth the other day, if she ever left, I would pursue her. I would go after her. I would not let her leave. That's what women need to know. Because we're different. If a guy loses his job, you know, at times it can be just the end of the world for him. Women's like, it's all right, I'll get another one. You know, we're just different. And we need to answer that question in the right way for our children. And as fathers, we have the power to answer the question. We have the power to change their world. We have the power to bring them up so they understand what they are to be as men and as women. The world calls it gender identity, but basically all it is that I know my role. I know my place in this world. I know what I'm supposed to do because my dad taught me. He answered the question. Failure. The son needs to know, I don't want to face failure. They need to understand that they have what it takes. They need to know that my dad, if nobody else, my dad believes in me. He knows I can do it. And when they're married, they need that from their wives as well. They know they can do it. They can succeed. They have what it takes. And women need to know that they don't have to face abandonment. Girls need to know that they're lovely, that they're worth pursuing, that they're worth fighting for, that they are special. I told the lady yesterday at the wedding, and actually I told the guy, I want to make sure that she heard me and was going to enforce it. You know, when we give them the wedding rings, and I talk about how it's made out of metal that's precious. I don't know if you've noticed, but gold went from about $200 an ounce a year or so ago to about $1,600 an ounce now. It's increased in value. It's become more valuable. That's the same way our love for our wives ought to be, guys. Over time, it ought to increase in value. It ought to become more precious, just as gold has become more precious over the last year. Our daughters need to know that they're lovely. Our daughters need to know that they're worth pursuing, they're worth fighting for, and that we as dads are always going to be there for them. Because if they have that understanding, they also understand that they are valuable. And how they react and interact with men or boys with girls later on in their lives is all going to come back to, what did my dad think of me? If my dad thought I was valuable, I think I'm valuable. I'm going to have a different interaction than if I don't think I'm valuable and I'm out there seeking value somehow. It all comes back to us as fathers. Do we teach our sons that they can do it, they have what it takes, that they can succeed? Do we teach our daughters that they're lovely, they're worth fighting for, they're worth pursuing? Because that's how they're going to value themselves. How well you show them how much you value them. And so here's the bottom line. What's love got to do with it? Some of us are older. Some of us, our kids have already grown up, they've left the house. Some of us have messed up, and we don't have a great relationship with our kids. But our kids still need to hear that answer. If your kids are older, if they've left the house, if they're boys, if he's grown and you're estranged, whatever it is, They still need to answer that. First Peter, the Apostle Peter, writing in his first letter, he said in verse 4, verse 8, or chapter 4, verse 8, most important of all, continue to show deep love for each other, for love covers a multitude of sins. If your son and daughter have left home, if they're already gone, be sure and call them. Be sure and write them a letter and say, I believe in you. You're worth pursuing. You're a lovely young lady. I'm 44 years old, I think. And married with 3 kids, and I still love hearing that from my dad. Well, my mom, it's nice to hear, but it doesn't have the same pull as when Dad gets ready to leave after visiting us and he says, you're doing a great job with the kids. You're doing a good job. You're a good dad. And it hurts when he says, you know, there's something about how you're raising your kids I need to talk to you about. It just rips me apart. 44 years old. The same thing. Boys don't outgrow. They need to hear from their dads. I'm proud of you. You're doing a good job. You can do it. You can succeed. And girls never outgrow the need to hear from their fathers. You're a beautiful young lady. Or young woman. Or whatever you happen to be. Fathers, this morning I want to say to you, you can do it. You have what it takes. You can succeed. Whether your kids are young or your kids are old, you have what it takes if you have the Spirit of God living within you to make a difference in your kids' lives, to change their world, to change who they are by acknowledging and answering those 2 questions for them. You're worth it. You're valuable. You're precious. You can do it. You can succeed. You can make a difference in this world. And when you make that difference for them, they can change the world around them. It's never too late. Regardless of their ages, kids need to know the answer to those 2 questions. So I dare you to go home and call them before they call you. Just say, hey, on this Father's Day, we're going to do it different. I wanted to tell you how proud I am. I wanted to tell you how lovely you are. Call them. Write them a letter. Let them know. Do whatever it takes that they can go through life with the answer to those 2 questions. They are worth it. They can succeed. They have what it takes. They're loved it. They're worth fighting for. They're worth pursuing. Let's go to the Lord. All right, Father, I am so grateful that you looked down on us and that you saw something within us